Thank you for coming today. We will hear from our guest in just a moment, but first a few things. We have decided to allow questions during her presentation, a little different than what we do usually, so just raise your hand, ask a question as she is making the presentation here. We also have a little reception planned after the presentation just across the hall. You're all invited. I did just check, and they have some orange juice and cookies in there, so help yourself. We're pleased today to have Danielle Conrad with us. Ms. Conrad graduated from UNL with a degree in poli-sci and went on to earn her law degree at UNL also. She served in the Nebraska legislature, so it is Senator Conrad, for 8 years, but past tense, no longer. She served from 2006 to 2014, at which time she was appointed as the executive director of the Nebraska chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. That was in November of 2014, and she holds that position still. Among other duties, she is also on the board of directors of Legal Aid of Nebraska, where we place interns. So some of you, present or future tense, might have some interaction with Ms. Conrad in that context as well. Ms. Conrad.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, thank you. Hi, good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon. Okay, there we go. The sun is shining. I know it's a cold day and it's a little dark in here, but the sun is out and I'm excited to be here with you, and thank you so much to Professor for the generous invitation to join you and to spend a little time talking about the ACLU, talking about mass incarceration, talking about smart justice reforms that we're focused on in Nebraska to try and dismantle said system of mass incarceration and find better outcomes for individual Nebraskans, their family, and our society as a whole. So I wanted to give you just a few top lines, a little bit of information about myself and our organization. Even though I've been at the helm of this beloved civil rights organization, which has been around in Nebraska for over 50 years and about 100 years on the national level, I thought everybody knows what the ACLU is. But as I've been crisscrossing the state over the last couple of years, I find out that sometimes not everybody knows exactly who we are or what we do. Now, since the November 2016 election, our position has been elevated a little bit more, so more and more folks are familiar with who we are and what we do, but I wanted to make sure that you at least had some of that basic information as well. Whoops, okay, yay. Okay, so you heard a little bit about my biography and how we got to where we are here today, but to fill out and enrich some of those details, I grew up in rural Seward County, about a half an hour down the road, and started volunteering on campaigns after a lightning bolt moment in 4th grade when Helen Busalis and Kay Orr were both running for governor. And I was sitting in my parents' kitchen and said, that's what I want to do one day. And so my folks were really kind and really accommodating, and they brought me to Lincoln. I decided I was going to be a Democrat, and I went to Helen Busalis's campaign headquarters and got a bunch of yard signs and t-shirts and all the campaign swag, and then went back home to rural Seward County and walked them around my section and asked all of my Republican farmer neighbors if I could put up yard signs, and they were very accommodating because they were good neighbors, and I was in 4th grade, so I was a lot cuter then and more earnest. But I followed everything I could about the campaign, and sadly my candidate was not successful. But shortly after the election, I had the opportunity, as I was shopping with my mom in Lincoln, to see Helen Busalis in a store when we were out doing some school shopping. And the way that my mom tells the story, I was speechless for both the first and last time in my life when I saw Helen, because she was such a big hero of mine. And so my mom went up and told her that I volunteered on the campaign, and she was very gracious and very accommodating, and came out to my country school in rural Seward County, and we had Helen Busalis Day. And we talked about government and politics and public service. And from that point forward, she was my friend and my mentor and my inspiration for public service. Before texting and social media, we used to write letters back and forth over many, many years. And when I was graduating from law school in 2003, Helen actually sent a packet of correspondence that she had saved over the years, spanning my My Little Pony stationery that I used to write to her about things, all the way up to more serious conversations about what type of law I might want to practice and how I could best attune my skills to being a strong public servant for the progressive values that we shared. It was kind of fun to go back and see some of those letters in the little kid handwriting, and admittedly my handwriting's not much better today. But I'd say things like, "Dear Mrs. Busalis, attached is a friendship bracelet I made for you, and P.S., what do you think about crime?" Or things like that. And she would always write back a really serious and thoughtful response. And so Helen was always my guiding force in politics and public service. And she stood next to me, shoulder to shoulder, when I kicked off my campaign for the legislature, right here in North Lincoln's Fightin' 46th Legislative District back in 2006. And she passed away by the time I ran for re-election in 2010, but she's definitely the guiding force in my career for public service. In the Nebraska legislature, after serving for 8 years and carrying out a lifelong dream and representing this district and being a strong champion for working families and public education, kindergarten through college, a lot of my signature positions that folks probably knew me best for was doing some defensive work in the legislature, fighting to abolish the death penalty, fighting for reproductive freedom, fighting for immigrants and refugee rights, and workers' rights, health, and safety. And in 2014, I ran the citizen initiative to increase the state minimum wage in Nebraska, which was a historic and exciting opportunity to give working families in Nebraska a hand up and to improve their personal economic situation and our state's economy as a whole. So then I had to find a job because I was constitutionally set into retirement because of term limits. And the ACLU came calling, and they had an opening in their executive director position. So it's been really fun to be able to dust off my law degree and help with our litigation a little bit, to keep a foot involved in the policy arena at the Nebraska unicameral legislature, and to go out and to do community engagement and empowerment and public education and speaking engagements like this across Nebraska, talking about the issues that we care deeply about and that we're working to make a positive difference on. So I'm just headed into my 4th year at the helm at the ACLU of Nebraska, and I'm here today to talk, do a little bit more of a deep dive on some of our work related to some of your interests in the criminal justice field and the crisis facing Nebraska prisons, how we got there, where we are today, and where we need to go moving forward to have better outcomes. So the ACLU, like I mentioned, has been around on the national scene for almost 100 years. We'll celebrate our centennial anniversary in 2020, and was founded by a small group of activists, attorneys, social workers, and other folks who came together to support free speech rights. Back before we had a large, well-established body of case law around First Amendment law. And since that time, we've been involved in some of the country's most interesting and important jurisprudence spanning freedom of religion and expression, whether that's students' rights and Tinker, or desegregation and civil rights and racial justice as amicus and partners in Brown versus Board of Education, constantly fighting for reproductive rights and truly living our values, even when it is sometimes the most difficult to stand up for the principles that we believe in. And it's very timely to note this as my beloved university is undergoing a very robust dialogue about the limits of the First Amendment and what that means as a balance for other rights like equal protection and equal justice and gender equity and how that might interface. But in terms of the ACLU's work, we've been very, very clear. We stand for a robust First Amendment and free expression. And then equally, fight for equity as voraciously as we can. But we've represented Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, who wanted to have a march through that community expressing their First Amendment interests. Some examples closer to home that might be a part of your experience. If you'll remember just a few years ago, there were a few student athletes on the Husker football team who decided to take a knee as part of a national campaign to protest racial justice and injustice justice and police brutality during the national anthem. We spoke forcefully in support of their First Amendment rights, but we fight just as equally for the First Amendment rights of pro-life student groups to organize in their individual schools and high schools across Nebraska when their rights are threatened. So it's not the content of the speech or the speaker that we're standing up for, but the principle of a robust First Amendment that we hold dear, and that is a bedrock of our constitutional values. We've continued to lead the way with cutting-edge litigation at the Supreme Court, particularly on LGBTQ rights issues, like the Obergefell decision a few years ago, which brought the freedom to marry to all Americans, and fighting to push back on laws that criminalized behavior, like as outlined in Lawrence versus Texas. So those are just a few of the highlights about some of our litigation work that you may have heard about or seen or read about in your history books or as part of your experience today. The ACLU is one of the organizations that most frequently practices before the United States Supreme Court. In any given term, we typically have about 25% of the cases that are before the court, either as direct counsel or as amicus, as cooperating and supporting counsel. This term alone, we have 5 signature cases on voting rights, on racial justice, on privacy, on redistricting, the list goes on, and on LGBTQ rights, again, in the Masterpiece Cake Shop, about the limits of non-discrimination and free expression and how that plays out as well. So this is a very exciting term that we're watching a lot of those cases to be coming down this spring. Okay, so the ACLU saw an outpouring of support in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, locally and nationally. Today, we stand at a strong 1.5 million members and counting. You may have heard, like, I'm a card-carrying member of the ACLU. What does that mean? It means you pay a membership due to support our work and to support our organization. We have 2 organizations, a 501c4 that really focuses on our political activity and work, and a traditional 501c3 nonprofit organization that supports our public education and our litigation work. So each ACLU has that similar type of structure. We have, we're one of the few national organizations that has a footprint and a presence in all 50 states and U.S. territories. And today we have over 300 litigators in the national office and boots on the ground in states all across the United States that are working on the waterfront, really, on critical civil rights and civil liberties issues, spanning the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, 6th, 8th, 14th, and everything in between. So the ACLU of Nebraska has been around for just over 50 years. Our organization was founded by a small group of activists in the 60s, and we celebrated our 50th anniversary in 2016, which was a really special milestone to reflect upon our history and to prepare for our future. It's interesting side note that I want to make sure that everybody has clarity about is that the ACLU does not take government support. We don't seek government grants, and we don't utilize government funds in carrying out our work. That's for a variety of reasons, but one is we primarily sue the government. And that might be a little bit awkward and might perhaps challenge our objectivity and ability to speak truth to power when we need to if there were purse strings attached. But that's something that is always surprising to interest to a lot of audiences as I'm out and about, so I want to make sure to highlight that. So we're a privately funded organization through individual donations and individual donations and foundation grants like other 501c3s, but without the government support. We are governed by an 18-member board of directors, which are all volunteer that span the state. Today, our small but mighty team has 7 full-time employees. We have 4 litigators, a communications director, an admin and finance person, and then we also have a contract lobbyist who handles a lot of our day-to-day at the Capitol. We also have over 50 volunteer attorneys statewide that help us to screen cases and bring cases forward to expand capacity in our litigation program. Today we have over 10,000 supporters in Nebraska, in every single corner of Nebraska, every single legislative district across the state, and we have over 20,000 online activists that take actions supporting online petitions, that respond to social media campaigns, that follow us on those channels and that speak out. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. Okay. So the ACLU uses 3 primary strategies, and this is a lot of nonprofit jargon, but it's called a sophisticated program of integrated advocacy. Okay, what does that mean? That means we sue people, we use our litigators in the court to defend and protect individual rights and freedoms. We empower communities through public education, community outreach, events like this, and know your rights trainings. And then we also influence public policy and engage in the legislative arena, both at the city council level, the state legislative level, school board level, and all the way up to the halls of Congress, flexing our muscle and providing credible research and feedback to policymakers across the political spectrum about civil rights and civil liberties issues. Last biennium in the Nebraska legislature, our organization took a position on over 100 unique pieces of legislation and recognized we're working on some of the most complex issues in a very difficult political environment. And our position prevailed an impressive 76% of the time. So even when folks have a disagreement with how we look at protecting and defending individual rights, we've worked hard to establish a nonpartisan, principled, credible approach to these issues that policymakers, regardless of their ideological beliefs, can count on and support. Okay, so to the issue at hand. I want to spend some time defining the problem. And the problem that I've been asked to talk about today, the issue that we've identified as a key priority at the ACLU of Nebraska and as part of our larger nationwide organization, is the era of mass incarceration that we find ourselves within. And what does that mean exactly? This is a statistic that is chilling to me, I think as a parent, but just also as a Nebraskan. Our system of mass incarceration has grown so unwieldy in Nebraska in the present day that about 1 in 10 kids have a parent in the criminal justice system. Let that sink in for a minute, about how many of our friends and neighbors who will be system involved at some point in their lives. And not only the impact for our prisons, but the lifetime collateral consequences that come with those criminal convictions for individuals and families, whether that means accessing public benefits or housing or employment opportunities or civic engagement like voting rights. These issues of mass incarceration intersect squarely with a variety of important societal issues that impact us all across the state. In addition to being so unwieldy and so large, there are significant racial disparities at every phase of our criminal justice system, from the first point of contact with law enforcement to which police interactions end up in tickets, end up in searches, end up in being taken to jail, for the incredible racial disparities and socioeconomic disparities when you look at our debtors' prison system in Nebraska and how Nebraskans who are waiting for trial before they're even found guilty or innocent, and while presumed innocent on any given day. In most of the large counties in Nebraska, Douglas, Sarpy, Lancaster, and Hall were 4 that we did a deep dive on looking at these issues about a year ago in our Unequal Justice Report. About half of the people in these large county jails are sitting there presumed innocent because they don't have enough money to bond out and go home to their families. On average, they're sitting there for about 48 days. while they're awaiting trial, while they cannot afford bond, many times for low-level nonviolent offenses. And think about what that 48 days means to families. Think about what that means for involvement in the child welfare system. Think about what that means for employment continuity and success. And the numbers are not a close call. Roughly about 10% of Nebraskans demographically are from communities of color. At each and every stage of these different aspects of our criminal justice system, over 50% of Nebraskans are from communities of color that are sitting in jail pretrial, that have extraordinary racial disparities in stops, in arrests, in searches. And in our state prison system today, and in our juvenile justice system today, the same disparities hold true. Well over 50% of those incarcerated in those systems are from communities of color, while only about 10% of Nebraskans in our general demographics are from those communities. So that's another shocking and startling reality that we have to acknowledge and that we have to address head on. And our prison reform work, our mass incarceration work, intersects squarely with our racial justice work. And is something that we always want to educate Nebraskans about. As I noted, in our county facilities and in our state prisons, more than half of those that are there presently are there for nonviolent offenses. Property crimes and in many instances, drug crimes and related offenses. Nebraska consistently has one of the lowest uses per capita for illegal drug use, but one of the highest incarceration rates for drug offenses, which is really out of whack and helping to drive our system of mass incarceration in Nebraska. So today in Nebraska, our state prisons, ranked by the Department of Justice, presently stand as the second most overcrowded system in the country. Let that sink in for a minute. As we think about Nebraska and we enjoy the good life, and there is a strong quality of life for ourselves and our families and our future, that's not true for all Nebraskans when you start to think about how unwieldy this system of mass incarceration is, and not only for those that are impacted the system, but the price tag that we all have to pick up as taxpayers to support that. So when you have extreme overcrowding, bad things happen. Number one, people's individual constitutional rights are not being met, but there's also a complete stress on the system and an inability to provide for basic things like access to health care or mental health care or programs and services, so that people, while they're incarcerated, can seek rehabilitation services and hopefully come out less likely to reoffend. But in an extremely overcrowded system, you see what you see is happening in Nebraska when you read the news or you turn on your local TVs. It's not normal in a prison system to have multiple deadly riots in multiple years. It's not normal to have constant onslaught of frontline staff assaults that are happening in our prison system. It's not normal to have this many people jam out of prison without any supervision or access to program and services, and then who are more likely to reoffend when they come back to their communities more sick, less hopeful, and without the tools to turn their lives around in a more positive direction. So today in Nebraska, system-wide, our state prisons are presently about 160% of their capacity in terms of what they're meant to hold. Some facilities, some individual facilities in the prison system are over 300% of capacity for what they're meant to hold. So what does this mean? This means that people are sleeping on cots, in hallways, on floors, in gymnasiums. There's no privacy, there's no space, it's crowded. It's really, really crowded, crammed in like sardines, which is really a recipe for disaster in many ways. And without access to programs and services, that's when you continue to see some of the tragedies play out. So under existing state law in Nebraska, The governor must declare a prison emergency by 2020 if prisons do not move below 140% of capacity. There have been important first steps towards meaningful reform in the criminal justice system taken by policymakers in recent years, but unfortunately, the numbers aren't moving, and they're not moving significantly enough, quickly enough. And we are projected to be at 170% of capacity in 2020, according to the most recent statistics. So what does that mean? That means that emergency remedies will come into play, and it will be up to the state of Nebraska to engage in prisoner release, whether through supervised tracks like probation or parole, or putting more people into county jails for temporary solutions, building more prisons, which are incredibly expensive and not quick to put up, or allowing people to be released back to their communities. So it seems like, oh, 2020, that's a while away, but it's really, really not when you look at the gravity and severity of the problem. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that the vast majority of people that are incarcerated in Nebraska and in most systems will return to our communities one day, well over 90%. I think that the most recent statistic I saw in Nebraska was even closer to perhaps 95%. So if people say this isn't my issue, I don't want to deal with it, you will have to deal with it one way or the other, either as a taxpayer who has to pick up the tab for this, or because we all have a shared public interest and public safety goal in ensuring that returning citizens that come back to our community are less likely to reoffend, so that we can improve family stability, improve economic outcomes, and improve public safety for all Nebraskans. There's some social media graphics here to the right as well that highlight some of the racial disparities in the system, that talk about the projections in terms of overcrowding, and that note that lack of mental illness and mental health treatment is a huge problem in the system. Well over a third, up to a half of those that are incarcerated have a mental health diagnosis. And as early as last summer, the state prison had no psychiatrists on duty. Yes, question?
I can touch on the psychiatrist
Sure.
thing. The state prison hired my dad to be the psychiatrist in July.
Yay, well, there we have it. Well, that's one important step in the right direction, but for a system that is so large and the needs are so great, Nebraska continues to struggle with recruiting and retaining top mental health professionals in the system, and having enough of them to meet the challenges that are before that population. And we deeply admire all of those that are willing to commit their lives to public service as well, like your dad. Okay, so how did this happen? Well, it wasn't an accident, and it didn't happen overnight. This is something that we call the State House to Prison Pipeline. This is something, when we're talking with correctional officials frequently, I'm always the first to admit and acknowledge those that are running our prisons and our jails did not create a system of mass incarceration. My colleagues in the legislature and the prosecutors and the attorney general and the governor and state and local and federal policymakers are really the driving force behind the system of mass incarceration. And so when we talk about the State House to Prison Pipeline, that means doubling down on bad and failed policy, like being quote unquote tough on crime or engaging in a war on drugs. Those kinds of policies which really originated in the 70s and have continued on the national level and on the state level, including in Nebraska, for decades. And so each session, there's more and more bills put in to make more things a crime that weren't a crime before, and to enhance criminal penalties for existing crimes. And there's also been a run over decades to even push for more extreme sentencing that reduces individual discretion for the judiciary and individual cases. When you look at things like 3 strikes laws or habitual criminal laws, or when you look at severe mandatory minimums, and particularly how those impact nonviolent offenders. So that's a huge driver. That's a huge driver and deliberate policy choices that have happened in this state over decades that we're just now starting to understand and to pull back from a bit. Another driver is one of the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system are prosecutors, our county prosecutors in Nebraska, and then of course the state's top law enforcement officer is also the Attorney General. They don't handle individual cases, but they help to set a lot of policy and a lot of tone. And individual county attorneys, a lot of folks don't know that they're elected officials. They rarely run in contested races, and so they kind of fly under the radar when it comes to the political realm. And the incredible amount of prosecutorial discretion that those individuals wield over people's individual life and the system as a whole is a huge driver in mass incarceration. And we'll talk a little bit more about changing the front end laws on sentencing reform, and we'll continue to push for those kind of positive, proven reforms moving forward. But until prosecutors stop overcharging people, we'll continue to have a system of mass incarceration. And there is just now a new movement that the ACLU is helping to initiate and implement across the country, ensuring that individual citizens know who their local prosecutors are, who know about their charging decisions, who see what kind of racial disparities may exist in the charging decisions in their office, and to see how those drivers impact our local systems of mass incarceration, to shine some light and some sunshine on the actions of prosecutors, which hold incredible power in this system. Because of the extreme sentence laws and the mandatory minimums and the habitual criminals and laws and the 3 strikes laws, judges don't have the same kind of discretion they used to have in order to ensure that the quote-unquote time really fits the crime, right? They don't have the same sort of opportunity that they've been afforded in years past to ensure that the individual sentence makes sense for the individual, for society as a whole, but instead must reflexively implement the laws that they are asked to by the state legislature. And that definitely ties their hands in terms of the types of alternatives that they have to sentence people to. So for example, when people have, let's say, a behavioral health issue or a mental health issue, in many ways, they need a public health response. They don't need a criminal justice response. But judges don't have enough discretion or clear alternatives to utilize those public health kind of responses to those kinds of issues. The other issue that comes along with this is while policymakers have been doubling down on these policy decisions, they haven't been working on the other side of the ledger, and this is something I know a little bit about after serving 8 years on the budget writing committee and in the appropriations committee. Mass incarceration is really expensive. Building prisons is one of the most expensive things that we do as a state, and incarcerating somebody is one of the most expensive things that we do as a state. It's been a while since I've refreshed my statistics, but it costs well over $30,000 a year to incarcerate a Nebraskan, and I think we spend less than $10,000 a year per individual student in the classroom. So think about that for a minute, and what that says about our policy priorities as a state and as a people. The other piece that contributes to our system of mass incarceration in Nebraska is that our parole system is broken. In other states and other jurisdictions that have a more soundly funded and run system, parole systems are more robust to ensure that people can return to their communities under supervision to get the kinds of treatments or services they need or to reunify with families and participate in the workforce. In Nebraska, our parole system is not working in a very robust manner, and that's something that's definitely contributing to overcrowding as well. And then the final piece is just the overall political considerations. It's because it's been such a big part of our political dialogue for so long. Politicians run on being tough on crime, and when they take the first steps towards meaningful reform, their opponents challenge them through phone calls and TV advertisings and mail flyers, that they're so soft on crime and going to threaten public safety, and those political issues and considerations are always in play for each of these different factors, and definitely weigh heavily on the minds of, I think, people of goodwill who are trying to do the right thing when they govern, but ultimately have to go back to their constituents for their reelection campaigns. And so that's something that is driving the system as well. So what does that mean for the ACLU of Nebraska? After years of sounding the alarm bell and writing report after report and publishing op-ed after op-ed and testifying on scores of legislation and saying clearly to state officials, if you don't address this problem, we will have no choice but to sue you, to bring forward system-wide litigation that addresses the civil rights, constitutional rights, and human rights abuses that are happening in Nebraska prisons. And so this is something that we don't take lightly. We have, of course, ethical considerations as attorneys, and this is a huge case for a small shop. So we worked, thankfully, with large private counsel from outside of Nebraska, some local partners, and national disability rights groups as well who've joined us. Just this last summer, we filed historic litigation in federal court on behalf of all of those presently in the Nebraska prison system, seeking not money damages, seeking access to health care, seeking access to mental health care, seeking an end to the over-reliance on solitary confinement and particular abuses that that practice has on the mentally ill, seeking better programs and services for juvenile offenders and for those that are in need of rehabilitative services. And this litigation is grounded squarely not only in mass incarceration, but in racial justice, in disability rights, and in gender equity, as Nebraska continues to see an increasing trend in the number of women behind bars as well. So in addition to this historic litigation that's presently before the Nebraska Federal District Courts, and as you know, litigation is not swift. So even though we've been on file for over 6 months, we're still at the procedural phase. Thankfully, the courts have denied the state's motion to dismiss our case, and so we're proceeding forward, which is a huge, big first hurdle to overcome, and shows the strength of the case that the court has already acknowledged. This summer, we anticipate the next big challenge will be on class certification, as we seek not only to represent the 11 individuals who are named as plaintiffs in our case, but all almost 6,000 individuals that are in the system. And we additionally do individual advocacy efforts. So outside of the courtroom, and it doesn't always make a lot of headlines, we work on behalf of individual prisoners as well to vindicate some of their rights. Some of our recent work has included advocating on behalf of transgender prisoners to ensure that they have access to appropriate accommodations and medical care, which for the most part we've been able to resolve very amicably with the Department of Corrections to ensure that our individual clients' rights are being met in that regard. Just this fall, we actually launched a grassroots campaign on behalf of incarcerated women. We did some additional research and found out that women who are incarcerated in the state prison system and in the county system weren't being afforded access to feminine hygiene supplies, tampons, pads, and panty liners. In fact, they were being charged for them and being charged exorbitant prices beyond what you and I would pay at Walgreens or at Walmart. And they're incarcerated, and they're disproportionately low income. And so it was a basic reproductive justice issue, gender equity issue, and just human issue about respect and dignity. So we launched an online campaign. We did a lot of proactive media work, and just a few weeks ago, both Lancaster County and Douglas County and the state prison systems have abolished that practice and started to provide free access to these services for these supplies for incarcerated women, which is a really small but important victory for the lives of these women and for the individual Nebraskans who spoke out and had their voices be heard and made a positive difference. Another case that we presently are litigating is on behalf of the rights of 2 prisoners who are in the system to get married. Freedom to marry is just that. It's a fundamental right that's afforded to all under our Constitution, including those that are incarcerated. Yet the state of Nebraska refuses to allow our clients to get married. Now, what does that mean if they get married while they're incarcerated? We're not talking about conjugal visits and those kinds of things. We're talking about the ability to acknowledge their love and commitment to each other and the ability to write letters to each other, which presently they're barred from doing because they don't have that relationship. That case has been fought diligently in the courts all the way up to the Nebraska Supreme Court and now back down on a technical issue for over 4 years. But that's an issue that we'll continue to pursue. Okay. So just do a little bit more about the prison litigation because it's such a big part of our work and such a hot topic amongst Nebraskans. So we have one of the most talented team of litigators assembled in state history. We have our litigators at the ACLU of Nebraska, our partners at Nebraska Appleseed, the Nebraska Association or the National Association of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing are on board, and a large national private law firm called Piper DLA, and the ACLU's National Prison Project that litigates these overcrowding and conditions cases all day, every day, successfully across the country. There's 11 named plaintiffs. Let me tell you about one, Jason Galley, who I've had the opportunity to interview during the course of this litigation. For example, one reason that Jason's case has been identified was that he had a broken femur that went untreated for years. So when we're talking about ensuring health care, and those are the remedies we seek, it's not some sort of Cadillac care, it's basic health care, like fixing broken bones, which aren't happening at an appropriate level of care in the state prison systems. Now, thankfully, since we filed suit, they did surgery on Jason's leg, and he is now going through his rehabilitation and those kinds of things, so that's good news, but there's lots of Jasons in the system whose individual medical needs are not being attended to yet that we'll continue to fight for. And like I said, we're not looking for a payday here. We're looking for policy change. We're looking for an end to pain and suffering. And because the system is so overcrowded and so under-resourced, in talking to the national experts who've handled these cases successfully in other states, when they looked at what was happening in Nebraska, they were aghast at how bad it was. We were doing our pretrial prep and, asking individual medical experts, doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists to look at individual case files and say, what are you seeing here, doctors? Are we meeting the standard of care? And they said, not even close. And in fact, it was so bad in some instances that they asked us to reach out on behalf of those individuals because they were worried somebody might die or something bad might happen while we were getting ready to firm up the case. And the response back from the Department of Corrections was, we don't see a problem. So the possible outcomes for the litigation will hopefully be the policy reforms that we talked about, significant investments into programs and services and facilities and staff, and that could come a couple of different ways. The legislature could act. We could negotiate a settlement with the state, which has happened in many other jurisdictions, or a federal court will order the state to do a prisoner release order or to make the investments requisite to meet basic human rights and constitutional rights. So the litigation risks for the state are significant. Litigation is not swift, it is expensive, and it has an uncertain outcome. And who picks up the tab for that? Not the governor, not the attorney general. We all do. We all do through our taxes. And that's something that every dollar we invest in that is not in our schools, it's not in our roads, it's not making the kinds of reforms that we need. So as state officials continue to delay and to aggressively litigate and defend these actions, that is a taxpayer resource issue for all of us that they need to hear from you about. Okay, so that's the bad stuff. But the good stuff, there are proven models that we can utilize in Nebraska to make a positive difference. But the first is something that we have to acknowledge, and that's we can't afford to build our way out of this crisis. If we take the incredible step to build a new prison, that's a big price tag, a very hefty price tag. And unless we fix, and I don't know if folks are following the budget situation right now, but we're about $200 million in the hole, and just in terms of balancing our budget with existing resources today. So it's not like there's tons of resources out there to go and build and staff a new prison, okay? That's the first piece. Or the political will to do that. There's no bills pending in the legislature to build a new prison in that regard. And if we don't fix the front end on sentence reform, and we don't fix the back end on parole reform, it's build and build and build in perpetuity. It's not build one prison, it's keep building while the system of mass incarceration continues to expand and grow and become more and more unwieldy. So that's something that we have to acknowledge, and that other states and the federal government to a certain degree have acknowledged and have started to pull back from. So what do we need to do? We need to do we don't have the luxury to focus on any one aspect of the criminal justice or prison system today because the problem's so bad, but that's okay. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can multitask, right? So we have to work on the front end, the sentencing, we have to work on the inside, the programs, services, staffing, facilities, and we have to work on the back end, parole and reentry to really make it work. But we don't have to come up with the ideas all by ourselves. The great laboratories of democracies that are our states have already moved forward in many states that are similar to the political landscape and the geographical landscape to Nebraska, who have instituted proven, positive, successful policy reforms to bring down their prison population and to have better outcomes. So on the front end, we're talking about sentence reform, getting rid of that extreme sentencing, making sure that the time really does fit the crime, giving judges more individual discretion for individual cases and not tying their hands, moving more people out of the system through diversion and problem-solving courts, having more mental health and care and treatment services at the outset before people are brought into the criminal justice system. And there are positive things happening in Nebraska in that regard. There's been a continual expansion of our drug and treatment courts in Nebraska that have very high success rate and are definitely helping to reduce the pressure on the overcrowding crisis and are improving people's lives. They're getting the kind of treatment they need to change and to move forward. Investments inside. This is still going to be expensive, but not as expensive as building new prisons in perpetuity. That means the frontline staff, like your dad and a lot of other folks that are out there who are hardworking and committed to public service, they need the resources and the training and the staff that they need to do their jobs. Right now, there's still mandatory overtime in Tecumseh. People are frequently working more than 12-hour days, and that is not a recipe for good outcomes when people are exhausted, when people are under incredible stress, when people don't have enough people to deal with the issues that they need to, or enough positive services and programs to help address those that are incarcerated. So there needs to be an infusion in that regard, particularly on the staffing for some of the systems and on the healthcare provision. On the back end, we need to improve our parole and probation systems, and we need to do things that don't carry a big price tag, like civic engagement. Removing barriers to voting rights for returning citizens has a demonstrated positive benefit in reducing recidivism. There was a bill last year that passed the Nebraska legislature with widespread political support that the governor vetoed, and the legislature didn't have a supermajority to overcome. Something as simple but important as that helps to address these bigger issues. We currently have bans on the access to public benefits, like food stamps or nutrition benefits for people with certain criminal histories, which impacts their ability to succeed when they need to rely on safety net, particularly at that critical point of reentry when people are struggling to find their footing. And we still have a lot of barriers to employment. When I was still in the legislature, Nebraska did pass the ban the box policy for public employers years that has helped to address some of these issues, but we need to now take the next step and expand that ban the box policy to the private sector as well. There's pending legislation in Nebraska to do just that, and reform our professional licensure structure, which has far too many barriers for second chance employment for far too many citizens. And one thing that's really cool about working on these issues is this isn't just the ACLU anymore that's talking about these things. When we talk about sentence reform, when we talk about occupational licensure reform, has anybody ever heard of the Platt Institute? They are a think tank that was started by Governor Ricketts that is definitely right of center, and that is our authentic partner on these issues. When we work on these issues at the national level, it's the ACLU with the Koch brothers. These are issues that are enjoying widespread bipartisan support in the communities, and that we need to share that message so that we get more bipartisan support in the legislature. We come from different angles and for different reasons to these issues, but the end result is the same, dismantling the system of mass incarceration. Okay, so what can you do as an individual citizen? Because it's such a big problem and there's so much to do. Don't underestimate your power. Don't underestimate your voice, which far too many of us do. I can tell you, having served in the legislature, we hear from the governor a lot, we hear from the lobbyists a lot. You know who we don't hear from? Our constituents. And you know who's the most powerful voice? Our constituents. And I think a lot of times people think that they have to be a subject matter expert before they engage, and this is a very sophisticated audience, so you already are subject matter experts in this area, but you don't have to be. The most powerful communications to elected officials are, hi, I'm Danielle Conrad, I'm a voter in your district. I'm really worried about prison reform. Can you let me know what you're doing about it? That's enough. That would do it. If you don't have the time to send an individual note, sign up for a group that advocates on behalf of these issues and respond to their action alerts and forward the form email. Something is better than nothing. Your voice is critical to holding politicians and elected officials accountable on these issues. Same goes for your county prosecutor. Ask them what they're doing to address mass incarceration, what positive issues reform issues that they're implementing from other jurisdictions. You can also learn more and speak out online and then bring that information to your networks, both social networks and around the kitchen table and coffee shops that you frequent, and talk about these issues with your friends and neighbors and family. Write a letter to the editor. This is an issue a strategy that I think a lot of times people overlook. Most Nebraskans get up, enjoy their cup of coffee, and they open up the paper and they want to see what the sports scores are from the night before. Let me tell you a little secret. Politicians open up the paper and start their day on the editorial page. They want to see what thought leaders, people who buy ink by the barrel, are saying about the issues that they're working on. So not only do they care what editors are writing about, they care what individual citizens are writing about in the letters to the editor section. It gives them a window into the public mindset and is another way to hold elected officials accountable. It's a pretty straightforward and simple thing to do. We have some tips available if you've never done it before to empower you to understand how to effectively write and submit a letter. And in Nebraska, they almost always publish them. So that's a really, really powerful way to address these issues and to get your voice out and start a dialogue. You can support groups like the ACLU, either financially or just signing up for action alerts to get more engaged and educated. And you can volunteer in the prisons as well. There's an awesome set of community partners that are doing direct services work in the prisons, whether it's prison ministries, whether it's Defy Ventures, whether it's any number of the reentry and prison groups that are out there that are doing awesome work up close and personal and making a positive difference. So I've also left, and I can share these PowerPoint or resources with you if it's helpful, or we can post it on our website, but these are some more, I think, a little meatier, more academic resources that I thought would be particularly appropriate for this audience. If you really want to dig in a bit more on some of the policy and legal research around Nebraska's prisons that we've conducted over the past years, that our national campaign for smart justice is working on a national level. Our partners Right on Crime, those are the folks on the other side of the political spectrum that are fighting just as hard as we are for the same kind of common sense, proven proven reforms is a fantastic resource to look at. Council of State Governments is leading reform efforts on a state-by-state basis, and including in Nebraska. And then the Vera Institute for Justice is just an amazing resource for all things criminal justice related. Okay, so that's it. So that's the ACLU, that's mass incarceration, that's smart justice reforms, questions, feedback, concerns, cookies. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Comments, questions, concerns, aggravations, frustrations.
I know Nebraskans
No
aren't
takers.
shy, but I know there's cookies waiting too. And I talked to you for quite a while, and you probably need to grab lunch before your afternoon courses. But was there anything that was most striking to you in the presentation, or was it all old hat that you've heard before? Yes.
I guess I just didn't know how overcrowded our prisons were. Like you said, there was 5,000 something.
Yeah.
Like 3,000 that we can hold. It was just really surprising.
It is surprising. Yeah, like I mentioned early in the conversation when we talk about, I don't know if everybody heard the gravity of the overcrowding problem in Nebraska's prison system. You know, I'm thinking the hometown that I grew up in Seward, when I was there 20 plus years ago, was about 5,000 people, right? Like that's how many people are incarcerated plus in our prison system today. Like if you would take like the whole town of Seward off the map, you know, that's kind of mind-boggling. I mean, that's the metric that makes sense to me based on my experiences. But when you think about like how out of whack it is and the pressure on the system, it explains a lot about some of the symptoms that we're seeing play out and the pain and suffering, not only for those that are incarcerated, but for people who are working hard on the front lines, who have a really difficult and dangerous job that's more difficult and dangerous because of these conditions. Yeah.
So I've done a little research on
good.
compassionate release and aging
Yes,
prisoners.
yes, yes.
Just wondering if there's been any movement on that in Nebraska and if the ACLU is any part of that movement.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a critical reentry kind of back-end reform issue that is definitely in the mix. So there was an interim study on compassionate release and medical release that was before the Nebraska legislature this last summer that we assisted in drafting. They had a great hearing this fall on those issues, and I believe there's at least 2, if not 3, for sure 2, bills actively pending in the legislature this year to ensure that we can establish a program like that in Nebraska. To be clear, none of these singularly are the fix, are a silver bullet. But together, you know, a few folks here, a few folks here, a few folks here, then it really starts to add up and make a difference on the larger overcrowding problems and, of course, the individual quality of life for people who are aged or facing extreme healthcare situations, and the prisons just can't provide for that in every instance. So we want to make sure that we establish a program that is thoughtful and recognizes that not everybody can afford care on the outside. Not everybody has a support system in place if they were to be released. But for those individual instances when it makes sense and it's right and there's no longer a public safety threat there, it's an important tool that other states have turned to help reduce overcrowding and to reduce price tag on medical costs and to have better outcomes. So definitely, I believe Senator Christ and Senator Bowles have both introduced legislation on that this session. I'm sorry I don't have the numbers burned into my brain, but you can look on the legislative website, and I'm sure they would love to hear about your research and your ideas. And I do think that one or both of those or some combination will be advanced from the Judiciary Committee. So I think it could be a really exciting session for compassionate release. Yeah? Yes, hi. Right. So I am not a criminal justice major, so if I get the terminology wrong, I'm still more of a student than an expert. You know, us poli-sci majors kind of dabbling over here, but my understanding and the terminology that we usually utilize is that prisons relate to the state system and that jails relate to the county system, and the distinctions usually being between those offenses that carry a year or more of jail time, the lower level in the counties, the higher level in the state system. So in the state system, we do have penitentiary. We do have the Nebraska State Penitentiary. We typically refer to the Nebraska prison system, and I believe they have a total of 7 institutions system-wide: the Women's Prison in York, OCC, LCC, the State Pen, Tecumseh, the Work Ethic Camp. I'm sure the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center. Those are really the key facilities in the state prison system. I did talk a little bit about our Deserts prison work, which is more focused on the county level system, and I believe there's 38 county jails in Nebraska, but we're primarily focused with and many of them overcrowded. We're primarily focused right now on the state prison system. Does that help to define the terminology a little bit? Okay.
I did see some other hands, but I think we're out of time.
Okay, we can
So-
wrap it. You have one more quick one?
Samantha?
Quick one.
I was just wondering, curious, you said that the individual advocacy, so occasionally
Yeah.
prisoners reach out. I was wondering how they get to you. So in other words, are you guys doing outreach in the prisons so that they're aware of resources, or how do they know?
Yeah, how do people know to contact us? So on any given day, we'll have dozens of intakes, either from those that are incarcerated or their families and friends, primarily through the mail, through snail mail. That's how we get most of the people who are reaching out for help. But we are out and about in the communities and in the prisons a fair amount, and so people know us from that work as well. And of course, they have access to media and to computers and can see about our work in the paper. And usually when we have a big story, the intakes kind of come up. But people can email, they can write, they can call, and that's a big part of our work. Is we can't help everybody all the time, but we do try and help as many folks as we can.
You have a sign-up sheet over here?
Yes, we have a sign-up sheet. If you want to get emails or learn more about these issues, feel free to sign up hard copy or go on our website or our social media channels. And we covered a lot of ground. I thank you so much for your kind attention, for your interest in these issues, and for your thoughtful questions about how we can work together to make a positive difference for all Nebraskans. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. And if you want to visit with her further, right across the hall with punch and cookies.